And hey, before we begin this morning, I want to say a huge thank you to Pastor Muta and Christine for having us out here. Come on, it's been a while, but I love it. You know, I don't get out to Relevant Church as much as I would like to. More invitations, please. I love it out here. But you know, I love it because I'm always on the phone. I'm always chatting it up with Muta. That I feel like I am already a part of the family. I do, and I like that. So to me, I don't feel like a guest speaker. I feel like I'm just kicking back with my friends. I like it. But hey, if I haven't had a chance to meet you yet, so my name's Tim. Like I said, my wife Steph and I, we lead Life Church over in Grand Haven. We've been leading Life Church for 13 years now. We've been married for a little over 17 years. We've got, come on. I tell you what, when she looks that good, it's not that hard. You know what I'm saying? You stick around in a situation like that. We got 4 awesome kids. I got one of them with me out in Relevant Kids right now. But hey, you probably noticed that I'm not originally from here. You know, I'm from Australia. And Australia is very different than it is over here. We talk different. We sound different. And so today, if I'm not making sense, if you can't understand what I'm saying, you got to let me know. Look, we use words differently where I'm from. Okay, over here you've got a weed whacker. We don't have a weed whacker in Australia. We got a whippersnipper. A whippersnipper. Which makes sense because it whips and it snips. I mean, that's what it is, a whippersnipper. You guys have got an easement in between the sidewalk and the road. We don't have an easement in Australia. We've got a nature strip because it's like a little strip of nature in between the road and the sidewalk. It's a nature strip. You know, when we go to the beach, we have different words for what we wear. I tell you what, the first time that I told our church how much I love wearing my thongs to the beach, I tell you what, we use words differently. They're flip-flops over here, just so you know. They're flip-flops. In Australia, they're not called flip-flops. No one told me that before I started talking about it. My whole church is freaking out about this weird dude from Australia wearing thongs to the beach. So hey, if I start to freak you out a little bit, if anything's getting lost in translation, all right, just make sure you, out of your notebooks, just get a little bit of paper, roll it up, just throw it up this way, and I will know that something went wrong. Man. But I tell you what, I love this series that kicked off last week. Adam, where are you? Man, did anyone feel like they got kicked in the teeth just a little bit? Especially at the end with those questions? I know, I was listening to that thinking, Muta, don't do me like this, man. Jeez. But you know what I absolutely love about Relevant and your pastors? You know what, I'm sure that there would be a lot of more comfortable churches to be a part of in the area. I'm sure there would be. But I tell you what, comfort never leads to calling. Comfort will never get you where God plans for you to be. So I absolutely love that you've got pastors who aren't afraid to step on some toes, who aren't afraid to make church a little bit uncomfortable and to make sure that the people who call Relevant home are growing into all that God has called them to be. I absolutely love that. And this series, man, Muta was telling me about it. And I remember thinking to myself, when I heard what he was talking about, that this series would be looking at and the reason behind it, I thought to myself, there could not be a more timely time or moment for this series than right now. Because I tell you what, you look around at the world right now, and it can be very easy to look around at it and start to freak out a little bit. I mean, you turn on the news, the radio, you open up a website, and what are you reading about? What are you hearing about? We're listening to wars that are going on all over the world. We're hearing about racial division, political turmoil, economic hardship, financial uncertainty. There are agendas getting pushed in every direction. An agenda possibly can be pushed. So it can be so easy to look around at the world right now and freak out a little bit. But when we look around at the world and we look at the role that the church has to play in it, man, these are the times that the church was made for. These are the times that we're here for. We wouldn't want to be here for any other time other than what we're facing right now. Listen, the darker that our world becomes, the brighter our light begins to shine. And so when we look around and when we see a whole lot of darkness, light's not meant to avoid it. Life's called to engage with it. Life's called to step into it. Life is called to get right up in that darkness and showing the light that we have on the inside. Man, I love the famous quote by Jim Rohn. He said, "Don't wish it were easier, wish you were better." Oh, come on. Now, I love how the early believers responded to times like this in their own lives. Because for them, they're in a time in history where they found themselves getting arrested, they're getting beat, they're getting thrown in jail, they're getting threatened with torture for simply preaching the gospel to the dark world that they lived in. But do you know what they did? They didn't back down. They didn't shrink back. They started to pray. And this is what they said: "Lord, hear their threats and give us, your servants, great boldness in preaching your word." Come on, man. We shouldn't be praying for easier times. We should be praying for boldness. We should be praying for courage. We should be praying for opportunity and stepping into every single one that we see in front of us. And these are the times that our world needs us the most, to show that there's hope, to show that there's a future, to show the world that God is not done yet. Man, we know what God's done for us, and we know He's desperate to do it for them. So this series, I believe, could not be any more on point than it is right now. And so last week, Pastor Muta was talking about Adam, how he was present, but he had no presence. Today, I want to have a look at another one of the Old Testament greats, one of the Old Testament heroes that we know about, we read about, we hear about. His name's Samson. And we're going to look at the importance of living with conviction over compromise. And I tell you what, I think this is going to help a lot of people. It's going to make it really, really practical. And we're going to look at how every single one of us can step into what God's got for us. But you know what's so interesting about Samson is that most people have heard a lot about Samson. Most of us know a lot about Samson. We read about him in the Old Testament. We see hints of him in the New Testament. We hear the stories of his strength, his feats, his failures, and his flaws. But what's quite incredible about Samson is that even though we get like a broad view of Samson, not all of us know a whole lot of the behind the scenes of Samson's life. Why it was that he had his strength to begin with. Why it was that his weaknesses overtook him. You know, what we're going to find out about Samson today is that just like every single one of us, Samson had a very clear call from God on his life. And God had every intention of seeing that call come alive. But it all hinged on Samson making himself available to God. Unfortunately, though, if you do know the story, Samson chose to go his own way. Over and over again, he would stray from the path that God had for him. But I also think that today we're going to discover that we actually have a lot more in common with Samson than maybe we would like to admit. You know, it's funny, I was thinking about speaking on Samson, you know, and I feel like Samson's one of those guys that he's mostly remembered for his shortcomings. I feel like every time he's up, you know, he's kicking back in heaven, he's just chilling with the homies up there, and "Oh, Samson, someone's talking about you again." Not again. Come on, guys. That was centuries ago. I know. I get it. I messed up. I got it, guys. I got it. Can we look at some of the good stuff? There wasn't a whole lot of good stuff, unfortunately. So I feel like for Samson, every time he hears his name getting spoke about, he's a little bit sad. He's a little bit sad. You know, today we're going to be opening up our Bibles. If you've got them, Judges chapter 13 to 16 is where we're going to be spending our time. And after last week's message, if you didn't bring your Bible, you're lucky Pastor Muta's not here. Listen, I'm not going to tell him. All right, but you better have it next week. All right. I want to have a look at a bit of a background to Samson to see why it was that he was such a big deal in the world. Samson was an Israelite, as most of us know. And what would happen with the Israelites throughout their history is they'd be chasing after God. And the whole purpose of Israelites being God's chosen people was God would teach them how to live, and they would live His ways. And as they lived according to God's ways, they would see God's best come out in their lives. And all the nations around them would see it happen. They would see the blessing, they'd see the favor, they'd see the provision and the providence. And they would say, "Man, we want what you've got." This was the purpose of it. And so the more they would live for God, the better their lives would be. And the better their lives would be, the more of that everyone else would want, and they would by default draw the world to God. The only problem was that they weren't always living for God. They would live for God, they'd experience the blessing, then they'd turn from God once they got it. This happens over and over again. And so what God would do every time that they would turn from him, he would allow a neighboring nation to come their way. They would advance upon them, sometimes overpower and overwhelm them. And in their hardship, in their distress, in those struggling seasons that they would find themselves in, they would turn back to God, recognizing that he is their source. And they would do this over and over again. When Samson comes on the scene, they find themselves in a moment like this. The nation had turned from God. They had been taken over by a neighboring nation called the Philistines, and they'd been taken over at this point for 40 years. And life was miserable. Life was miserable. But then we read about Samson. Samson was the one who God was bringing into the world to bring deliverance to the nation. This was why he had his strength. This was why he had the gifts and the talents and the skill sets that God blessed him with. He was the one that every single person in the nation was waiting on. In Judges chapter 13, God announces that Samson's coming onto the scene. He said, hey, don't worry, guys. I know it's been 40 years of suffering, 40 years of misery. But Samson is coming, and he'll bring restoration to the nation. In fact, Samson's name actually means sunshine, or like the sun. And so in one of the darkest moments of God's people's history, sunshine was coming onto the scene. So Samson's a big deal. Samson is a very big deal. What we find is that he had absolutely everything that he needed to fulfill the call of God on his life. He had everything that he could possibly need. Unfortunately, he did not step into it. But you know what I actually love about Samson, and what I find reassuring about his story, is that he's got to be one of the most relatable people in the whole Bible. You know, I'm not sure if you're anything like me, but sometimes I read the Bible and I look at what the Bible heroes and the Bible greats did. And I think to myself, I could never do something like that. Man, I read about people like Nehemiah, who rebuilt the walls of Jerusalem. David, who's slaying giants. Joseph, who goes from slavery to running a nation. We read about Joshua. He marched around a city 7 times, and then 7 times again, and the walls fall down. These stories I love to read. We learn a lot from them, but sometimes they can make me feel a little inadequate about myself. Sometimes I read of what other people have done and wonder if I could ever amount to half as much as them. But you know, this is what's so great about Samson. You know, if anyone does not belong in the category of Bible greats, it's Samson. If anyone does not belong in the Hebrews chapter 11 Hall of Fame, the Hall of Faith, it's Samson. This guy did the opposite of what God called him to. He was a gambler, a drinker, full of rage, anger, vengeance, and violence. He was completely unpredictable. He was always up and down with his walk with God. One day he's on fire, the next day he's gone crazy. This is the life of Samson. And if anyone doesn't belong in Hebrews chapter 11 in that Hall of Faith, it's him. But if there's one guy I feel like I can relate to, it's him. In fact, I think we all can. And as we learn a little bit more about Samson today, I think you'll be amazed at just how similar to Samson every single one of us are. You know, just like Samson. I'm sure a lot of people in this room know what it's like to come from a godly home. A lot of us know what it's like to live with expectations that have been placed upon us by other people. A lot of us know what it feels like to be tempted physically. All of us at times struggle with the desire for vengeance and revenge. All of us at times choose our will over God's. So we've all been there. We all understand it. And when we read of Samson struggling and failing and coming up short, we all know exactly what that feels like. But that's what makes Samson so relatable. Because Samson is just like us. In fact, I would say that there's a little bit of Samson in all of us and a whole lot of Samson in most of us. But you know, this goes for the call of God as well. You see, of all the people in the Old Testament, Samson had the clearest call of God on his life. He was pre-announced before he was even here. He's got all of the gifts and talents and skill sets to fulfill it. He has been outlined every step of the way of what his life really is meant to look like, what he should be doing. If anyone should have succeeded, Samson. If anyone could have had it all, Samson. If anyone had all of the advantages that life had to offer, it is Samson. But listen, even though he had all of that, the potential wasn't enough. The calling wasn't enough. Samson lacked the conviction that the call of God required. And listen, even though Samson had calling, he did not have conviction, and it resulted in a life of compromise. I'm sure you've heard it before, how conviction will keep you where talent will take you. And hey, talent might open the doors, but it's conviction that will keep you in the room. And you know, this is what we're looking at today. Living lives of conviction over compromise. And so if you've got your Bibles, like I said, we're going to be starting out in Judges. We're going to be spending a lot of today in Judges chapter 14. If you've got your Bibles or your YouTube, don't go on YouTube right now, your YouVersion Bible apps, open them up. You know, I want to have a look at the kind of compromise that I want to talk about today, because really there are two types of compromise in life. You've got your black and white compromise, and these are the compromises that are really obvious. These are the really clear kind of things. These are the ones that we think to ourselves, of course I would never do that. That's black and white. I don't even need to think about it. A lot of these decisions we know about in life, we don't need to think about it. We don't even need to pray about it. Should I go and lay down in the middle of the road in the middle of night? No! Should I see how much dishwashing liquid I can drink at one time? No! Should I have an affair? No. Should I sleep with my boyfriend or girlfriend? No. Should I rob someone on the way home from church today? No. Listen, these are black and white. These are obvious. These are clear. They don't require thought. They don't even require prayer. You know, I know for me, there's been more than a few times in my life when I've had these situations arise where I had to make these black and white decisions not to compromise. Now, I remember when I was growing up, all of my friends were into dirt bike racing. I had friends that had dirt bike tracks in their backyards. They'd be riding in the dunes. They'd be riding in the trails. But I didn't have a bike yet. And so I'm watching all of my friends ride bikes, and I knew that I needed one if I was going to keep hanging out with all of my friends. And so I started searching for a motorbike, a dirt bike. And I started realizing that my budget was not going to get me a bike that could do anything cool at all. But then one day, one of my friends hit me up and he said, hey, I know you're looking for a bike. I know a guy that can get you a really nice bike, man, brand new, still in the crate. And it's really cheap. I was like, oh man, that sounds awesome. He said that he had already got one off this guy. He knew who it was. He knew how to make it work. So I thought, awesome, man, I'm gonna get one of these bikes. And I started looking a little bit more into it. And I found out that the reason that he was able to sell these dirt bikes so cheap is because they weren't his to sell. He worked on the docks at Sydney Harbour. And then these crates would come in and he would take them home and then he'd sell them off to other people. This was a stolen bike. And listen, in Australia, you cannot get caught on a stolen bike. You can't. If you steal a bike, that bike's yours. No one's going to find that bike. What a lot of people do, they'll steal dirt bikes and they'll just switch out the plastics, the stickers. Looks like a totally new bike. If your bike gets stolen, you will never see it again. When we went riding, when Steph and I used to ride trails together, man, we'd put them on our trailer and I'd put a padlock on the front of our bikes. I'd put a padlock on the back of our bikes so you couldn't roll them off the trailer. I had a bike lock there. I'd lock my bikes to each other so you couldn't just lift one off. You'd have to lift them both off. My bikes, both tied to the trailer, locked down. My trailer, locked to my car. I've got more money in locks than I do motorbikes, man, like dirt bikes. But I tell you what, I remember hearing about this dirt bike that my mate was trying to sell me. And I had to tell him, man, I can't do it. Like, stealing is black and white. That's just how it is. That's a given. I think we're all on the same page with that one. We shouldn't be stealing. Stealing's black and white. And so he's taken possession of stolen property. And so I had to tell him no. And you know, it resulted in me riding a dodgy dirt bike for the next 6 months while I saved up for another one. But for me, that decision was black and white. Either I was going to stand in my conviction or I was going to bow to compromise. You know, we all face decisions like this in life. or these black and white decisions, where really it is easier to stand in conviction than it is to bow to compromise, because the outcome is so clear. It's easier to stand in conviction because it is black and white. You know, this is why it's always so surprising when we hear of people that do choose to go down that route. When we hear of people that make these decisions that are absolutely devastating to their lives, and the results of their action was so clear to begin with, we find ourselves asking those questions. What were they thinking? How did they do that? Why did they do that? You know, it's even worse when we find ourselves asking those questions about the things that we have done. What was I doing? What was I thinking? That was black and white. Well, most of the time, and this is what we're going to find today, most of the time, you don't just end up there. You don't just wake up one day and compromise something that was black and white. What happens is you start compromising in the grey areas of life. And this is what we're looking at today, the grey areas of compromise. Because like I said, most of the time that we compromise in the black and white is only because we've already compromised something that was grey. No one just wakes up and decides to ruin their lives. No one just wakes up and says, you know what, this is going to be catastrophic, I'm all in. No one does that. No one has a goal to become addicted to pornography. That's black and white. But they might see an ad on their computer screen or on their phone. 1 click, 2 clicks, 3 clicks. Before long, you've clicked so many times that you find that you can't even stop. No one has a goal to become broke. Man, that's black and white. But they buy one thing they don't need, and then another, and then another. And then they borrow some money to get something else, borrow some more money for another thing. And before long, they discover that they don't really own anything. And all the things that they have is less than what they owe on them to begin with. Yeah. You know, no one has a goal to have an affair. That's black and white. But they see someone cute, maybe at work, maybe at the gym. They start spending time with them. They start flirting a little bit, a short text here, a soft touch there. And before long, they find themselves in a place with a person that they never thought they would. But it all begins in the grey. Nobody sets out to make these decisions that have disastrous effects on life. No one sets out to compromise in the black and white. We're careful not to do that. But what most people don't realize is it's those small decisions that pave the way for the big ones that take us out. You know, this is why Solomon in the Old Testament, he said, catch for us the foxes, the little foxes that ruin the vineyards. I love that. The little foxes, not the big things. It's the little things that are going to creep in and wreak havoc. This is why the Apostle Paul, in the New Testament, he said a little yeast works through the whole batch of dough. He didn't say to ruin a whole loaf of bread, you got to dump a whole bunch of yeast. So he says, no, just a little bit. And it starts infiltrating and permeating the rest. Now, the truth is that minor compromises always lead to major consequences. Minor compromises always lead to major consequences. You know what's so amazing about this, and hopefully will be encouraging for us today, is that as long as we stay on top of the grey, we don't even need to worry about the black and white. If you stay on top of the small, you don't have to worry about the large. The only problem is that because the small seems so small, we don't often give it the attention it deserves. You know, being from Australia, I find myself flying there quite a bit these days. A few times a year, I'm on a flight to Australia to go and see my family. And what absolutely amazes me about flying to Australia, I'm not sure if anyone here has flown to Australia, but the flight from LA, from Los Angeles to Sydney, is 17 hours. 17 hours. You're going about 550 mile an hour, you're 30,000 feet in the air, and for 17 hours, you do not see land. None of it. Like, you might see a tiny island every now and again, but for the most part, it's 17 hours of nothing but ocean. And I'm always amazed every time I land in Sydney. I'm always amazed that we made it. I am. Like, that's a long way. And I'm not sure what kind of technology the planes have. Obviously, it's pretty good, but I don't get how you can leave from one location and fly for 17 hours and end up on like this tiny runway. Like that is precision. You know what? In 1972, there was a situation where the precision wasn't so precise. Yeah, there were a bunch of New Zealanders. Now, New Zealanders to us are like Canadians to you. Okay? Okay, yeah, it's like the little Americans that couldn't. You know what I mean? You know what I mean? You know, and we make jokes about them, and we're fine with it. They don't like the jokes. We don't mind the jokes because we're secure because we know we're better. You know, that's just kind of how it is. That's what it's like for the Australians and the New Zealanders. Anyway, so we've got these New Zealanders. They jumped on a plane. They went to Antarctica. Okay, and what the pilots did not realize was that when they began their flight journey, they were 2 degrees off course. Not a big deal. It's not like they were going the wrong direction. It's not like they were going somewhere completely different. I reckon a lot of people would even say 2 degrees off, close enough is good enough. Well done. But I tell you what, this 2-degree error that these pilots made meant that when they arrived in Antarctica, they were 28 miles east of where they were meant to be. Now, what they didn't realize is that 28 miles east of where they were meant to be is an active volcano called Mount Erebus. It stands 12,000 feet high. And because they made a simple, seemingly insignificant 2-degree error at the start of the trip, they flew into that volcano and killed 257 people. But you know what made that possible? A 2-degree error. It wasn't black and white. They weren't going the completely opposite direction. It was a 2-degree error. These pilots did not plan on going down a path that would lead to the loss of 257 lives. All they did was started with a seemingly insignificant error that they never changed. You know, this is why for us, it is so important to pay attention to the grey, the small, seemingly insignificant areas of life that might not seem huge at the time. They might not seem huge at the time, but they lead to disasters down the road. You know, as the great C.S. Lewis, who once said, the safest road to hell is a gradual one. The gentle slope, soft underfoot, without sudden turnings, without milestones, without signposts. It's not the big things that make a difference. It's the small things that lead us to the big things. This is why in the New Testament, the Apostle Paul, he said, be alert and of sober mind. Your enemy, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, looking for someone to devour. We have an enemy who seeks the destruction of our lives. He wants nothing more to see us make decisions that will lead to devastation. You know, he knows that we're not going to take the bait on the big things, on the black and white things. So he sets up those small temptations in front of us, those grey areas that he will use to get a foothold in our lives and use to take more ground every chance that he gets. Now, this is why when we read in the New Testament, the Apostle Paul talking about the enemy trying to get into our lives, he tells us not to give the devil a foothold. In other translation, it says to give no opportunity to the devil. And this is why today we're not really focusing on the black and white areas of compromise, because we all know that we shouldn't, and we all do avoid it. We're looking at the grey areas, because if we can win in the seemingly insignificant areas of the grey, we will, by default, win in the significant areas of the black and white. So I want to quickly just look at 3 areas that Samson compromised in. 3 areas that when we hear these, we will realize that all of these areas apply to our lives as well. The first thing that Samson did, Samson compromised where he was. You see, when it comes to compromising where we are, so often, just like Samson, we find ourselves in situations justifying where we are, when we really should be denying that to begin with. If you remember for Samson, he was a Nazirite. A key part of a Nazirite's vow was that you could not drink wine and you could not consume anything that came from the vine. Basically anything grape-related, off limits. But this is where we find Samson in Judges chapter 14. It says Samson went down to Timnah together with his father and mother. As they approached the vineyards of Timnah, suddenly a young lion came roaring toward him. The Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon him so that he tore the lion apart with his bare hands as he might have torn a young goat. But he told neither his father nor his mother what he had done. So here's Samson going down to Timnah. At some point, he's separated from his parents. He's there all by himself. But this is where the compromise comes in. This is where we find Samson in the grave. So remember, he wasn't allowed to consume anything grape related. And here he is hanging out in a vineyard. This is great. Because technically, there was nothing wrong with being in a vineyard. He wasn't drinking wine. He wasn't getting drunk. He wasn't eating the grapes. He was there just hanging out in a vineyard. He couldn't eat. He couldn't drink anything grape related, but nothing said anything about not being around them. And so for Samson, technically he was in the clear. But this really was about as grey as it gets. Even though he shouldn't be there, technically there was nothing wrong with it. You know, I remember when I turned 18, all of my friends were going night clubbing. And in Australia, you've got to be 18 years old to get into the nightclubs. And I remember looking at all of my friends going out night clubbing. I was younger, so I wasn't a part of that scene. And it looked like they were all having so much fun. They'd always invite me out, and I'd say, oh, I'm not old enough yet, I can't go. And I remember when I was about to become 18 years old, I was talking to my leader, my mentor at church. I said, hey, I'm about to be 18, you know. Everyone goes to these clubs, and they sound so fun. There's all these flashing lights. There's lots of people. There's loud music. There's dancing, and there's fun. Oh, man, I can't wait to be able to hit it. And I remember having a conversation with Nick, my mentor, and him telling me that nightclubs probably weren't the best place for me. And I knew that a lot of my friends went just to have fun. I also knew that a lot of my friends went for other reasons. In Australia, and I'm sure as it is here, around the whole nightclub scene, there's a whole lot of drugs and carnage that goes with it. And a lot of my friends would go for that purpose. And I remember talking to Nick about it and saying, yeah, I know that's why they do it, but that's not why I'm doing it. I'm not going there to take drugs. I'm not going there to meet girls. I'm going there because it looks like it's fun. We're going to dance. There's some loud music. It's going to be great. Technically, there's nothing wrong with what I'm doing if I go to these nightclubs. And I remember Nick talking to me about this, and he said, yeah, I know that there might not be anything technically wrong with what you're doing, but you're placing yourself in an environment where you'll be surrounded by temptation everywhere. And I remember him talking to me about it. One thing he said to me really stuck out to me. I always remembered it. He said, why would you place yourself for a night in the devil's playground? He said, man, you know what's in that place, and you know how the enemy's using it. Why would you place yourself in it? And so for me, I decided that I would not go night clubbing when I turned 18. But you know what I did in that situation? I made a decision before I turned 18. I made the decision before that compromise would even get in my life. I made that decision before I even could make it. You know, there are a lot of areas in our lives where we wait until we're there to find out what we're going to do, when the whole time we could have made a decision preemptively. And so then when we get to it, we're already ready and prepared to make sure that we can stand firm. You know, there are other situations where we find ourselves in. I remember when I started following Jesus. I started following Jesus when I was 15 years old. Up until then, I lived a life that was not Christ-like at all. I got into drugs and alcohol when I was 12 years old. And so even though I didn't have a whole lot of time in that world, for me, it became a daily thing. Every day we were doing drugs. Every weekend we were drinking. We were mixing drugs continually. And I remember when I started following Jesus, I remember I had to make a decision not to go to the parties that I used to go to. And it wasn't because I was better than anyone. It wasn't because I was too holy to go to them. It was because I knew that I could not say no if I went there. And for me, I wanted to keep following Jesus. I wanted to see his call come alive on my life, but I also knew that I wasn't strong enough yet. And so for me, I had to no longer go to the parties that I used to. You know, we all have areas in life where we need to stop going to the places that we used to. And you know what? We can justify those places. Technically, there might not be anything wrong with it. But first of all, why would we place ourselves in the devil's playground? And why would we put ourselves in situations where we even do need the strength to say no to begin with? I knew for me, if I went to those parties, I would be stepping back spiritually. I would be veering from the call of God on my life. So I had to say no. You know, for all of us, it might not be the clubs, it might not be the parties, but we all have situations like this in life that we're faced with. Those areas that there's nothing inherently wrong with them. You can argue that it's okay to be there. You're not doing the things that others are doing. You're not doing what you used to anymore. But you know, it's no coincidence that Samson was attacked by a lion when he was in a place that he never should have been to begin with. Samson was in a vineyard, surrounded by the very things he was called to avoid. He wasn't drinking the wine. He wasn't eating the grapes. He could still justify where he was. It was not black and white. It was grey. But it was being in the grey that led to him being attacked by a lion. Remember, your enemy, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, looking for someone to devour. And when we look at when he attacked, it was when Samson was found in the grey. And you know what? Samson survived. This time. Samson survived this time. The lion attacked him. He fought back and he won. But if you keep following Samson's life, because he continuously compromised in the grey, it ended up costing him everything. You might feel like you've been attacked and you stood firm. You might feel that, hey, now I go to these places that maybe I shouldn't be, but so far it's all good. Maybe you have survived. So did Samson. But eventually it cost him everything. Hey, if you want to avoid compromising in the big things, we need to avoid compromising in the little things. You want to avoid the black and white, you've got to first steer clear of the grey. Hey, the Apostle Paul said, all things are lawful. They're justifiable. You could get out on a technicality. All things are lawful, but not all things are helpful. All things are lawful, but not all things build up. It might be allowed. It might be explainable. It might be justifiable, but it does not mean it's beneficial. It does not mean it's going to lead to God's best in your life. So don't put yourself in an environment where it's easy to make bad choices. Don't spend time with people who will make it easy to make bad choices. Hey, on a practical level, if you can't just have one, don't even go to the pub. If your finances aren't strong, don't go walking through a car lot. If that girl at work is cute, but she is not your wife, stop hanging out with her. If the people you spend time with are going down a different path than you, change your friends. If your business operates unethically and you feel yourself starting to operate like that as well, find another job. Hey, if you're not married, don't have your girlfriend or your boyfriend over at night when no one else is there. These are little things, I know. Little things that technically might not even be wrong or sinful, but they matter. They matter. Solomon said, catch for us the foxes, the little foxes. They ruin the vineyards that are in bloom. Not the big things, the little things. Hey, if we want to win in the large areas of life, all you need to do is be purposeful in the small areas. Come on, Samson compromised where he was. Samson compromised what he touched. And you know, we're running out of time, so I'm going to be short with this one. But if we look at the story of Samson, hey, it said that Samson went down to Timnah together with his father and mother. They approached the vineyards of Timnah. Suddenly a young lion came roaring towards him. The Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon him so that he tore the lion apart with his bare hands as he might have torn a young goat. But he told neither his father nor his mother, what he had done. Okay, what I want to look at from this. What I want to look at from this. Hey, he was in the vineyard. It was a grey area and the lion attacked him. He told no one about it. He was in the grey and he did something grey. He kept it to himself. And then look what happened next. Sometime later, when he went back to marry her, he turned aside to look at the lion's carcass, and in it he saw a swarm of bees and some honey. He scooped out the honey with his hands and ate as he went along. When he rejoined his parents, he gave them some and they ate it too. But he did not tell them that he had taken the honey from the lion's carcass. Okay, another part of the Nazirite vow, you can't touch anything that is dead. And here's Samson all up in a dead animal, eating the honey that he found inside of it. Like, slow down, Samson, what's happening? You're not meant to touch anything dead and you're all up in it. But you know what happened? In that moment, he was doing something very black and white. Okay, being in the vineyard, that was grey. That was grey. Getting all up in a dead body, black and white. But you know what happened in both of these situations? First of all, hey, he compromised in the grey in the vineyard, ended up diving into a black and white situation. But it says in both situations that he kept it to himself. When he killed the lion, he chose to keep it to himself because it was small. When he dug into the lion, he had to keep it to himself because it was big. Because Samson was not vulnerable with the compromise that he made in the grey, he had to be defensive about the compromise that he made in the black and white. But you know, if Samson just did not keep the grey to himself, if he said, hey, you know what? I did something that I probably shouldn't have been in the vineyard, but I did go to the vineyard. Hey, you guys need to know about this to help me stay on track with the call of God. I'm called to deliver the people, free a nation. Hey, we want to make sure that we do that and say, hey, I can feel there's a little bit of compromise in my life right now. Can you guys just keep me accountable, speaking, and keep me on track? If he did that, he would have had people around him that would have saved him from the black and white situation that he found himself in. And listen, the truth is we all struggle with the grey areas in life. And none of us want to find ourselves in the black and white areas. We all struggle with the small things. None of us want to be destroyed by the big. But the way that we avoid being destroyed by the big is by being real and open about the small. When it comes to the things that you struggle with, let others know. When it comes to the battles you fight, don't fight them alone. The truth is you can only do it on your own for so long. We read about Samson. He did. He made it through a bit, but because he was alone, it cost him everything. Listen, it doesn't matter how strong you are. If you choose to do life alone, you will eventually be defeated. Samson was the strongest man there was, and not even he was able to do it by himself. He kept his struggles to himself, and eventually they grew to the size that he could not handle, and they ate him alive. Hey, Samson compromised where he was. He compromised what he touched. And third, Samson compromised who he was with. Now, when we follow the life of Samson, it's very clear that he was not careful and purposeful with his relationships. He didn't let good people into his life, and he continually aligned himself with people that he shouldn't. And there was one relationship in particular that led to his downfall. We read about her in Judges chapter 16, where it says, sometime later he fell in love with a woman in the valley of Sorek whose name was Delilah. Come on, this is where the infamous story of Samson and Delilah begins. It was a relationship that he never should have had. It was a relationship that cost him his life. He wasn't meant to be with a Philistine woman, and he knew it, but he chose to do it anyway. And it didn't seem like it was that bad. It was just one person. It was just one relationship. And he was really strong. So he should be able to handle it. Surely this would not have a big impact on his life. I'm not sure if you've ever felt like that in your life before, where you find yourself justifying a relationship that you're in. They aren't that bad. I mean, there's a lot worse people to be hanging around. And anyway, I know that I can fix them. I know that I can fix them, so it's good. I know they're not following Jesus, but I'll bring them to church. Relevant, listen. The Bible makes it very clear about the relationships that we're called to have. In 2 Corinthians 6 verse 14, it says, don't be unequally yoked with unbelievers. For what partnership has righteousness and lawlessness, or what fellowship has light with darkness? This goes for who we're friends with. This goes for who we choose to date. This goes for who we commit to in marriage. But listen, the relationships that we have in our lives, they play a tremendous role in them. They will determine who we are, who we become, and whether or not we fulfill the call of God on our lives. Now, for Steph and I, we have a small farm that we run, or at least we did until about 2 months ago when our house burnt down. Don't have that farm at the moment, but we will by the end of the year. But we've got this farm, we've got goats, and we've got turkeys and chickens, and we've got pigs, and we've got bunny rabbits, and we've got all of these animals going on. And one thing that we do is when it comes to feeding all of our animals, we go and get bulk produce. We'll get 1,700 pounds of produce, fresh produce at a time. And because we have all of this produce on our property, we have to make sure that all of our produce is good. And if we see a bit of produce that's going bad, we quickly throw it away. Because if we don't, it makes the whole rest of our produce go bad. You know, when it comes to sick kids, I'm not sure if you've noticed, but if you've got a whole bunch of healthy kids and one sick kid is introduced in the mix, what happens? They all catch the plague. Exactly, that's what's going on. You know what we have found, and what's interesting about our produce and our kids is that I can't take one bad bit of produce and throw it in with all of the good produce and have the good produce make the bad produce good. I can't throw a sick kid in the midst of all of the healthy kids and the healthy kids make the sick kid healthy. It doesn't work like that. In 1 Corinthians 15, it says that bad company corrupts good character, not the other way around. You know, I know for me, I've had to be very purposeful with my relationships and my friendships, because for me, I know that I can be very easily influenced by others. You know, I remember I had some people that I was hanging out with to bring to church. It was when I was living in Australia. I was into a sport called base jumping for a number of years, and one of the people I was trying to get to church was my base jumping instructor and his girlfriend. And my base jumping instructor, Feral, his name was Feral. He legally changed his name to Feral, like the animal, like a feral animal. Feral was out on parole. He got 10 years he got caught with $3 million worth of marijuana in Australia. And so he was out on parole at the moment, and his girlfriend, she was on a 25-year parole for much more nefarious crimes. And so I was hanging out with these two people who desperately needed Jesus. And I remember I would be with them every weekend. We'd be in the mountains, we'd be jumping off cliffs, we'd be hiking together, we'd be going all over Sydney finding new spots to base jump from. And I spent a whole lot of time with these people. And I remember every time I was with them, I was really purposeful in trying to tell them about Jesus. And I remember one day after probably 1 or maybe 2 years of hanging out with them, trying to get them to church, trying to get them to know Jesus for themselves, I turned up to Buffy's house. I remember opening the door. And I walked into this house, and if I told you what was on the inside of this house, man, it would make you blush. It was absolutely insane, the level of sinfulness in this house. And I remember opening the door and walking in, and I'm just a part of it. I sat down, and all of a sudden I looked up and I looked around at what I was surrounded by. And I realized that I was no longer shocked. I realized that this had become normal. I realized that this was now my life. And I realized I'm not influencing these people. I'm being influenced by these people. And I can justify hanging out with them under the guise of I'm telling them about Jesus. But at the end of the day, all of this that's going on that should be absolutely shocking has become normal to me. And so I left that house and I went home and I bought a wetsuit because all the boys in church surfed. And I hadn't surfed in a while because I was hanging out with these people. So I bought myself a wetsuit to be surrounded by people who would encourage me on the call of God in my life. I would be purposeful in surrounding myself with people who would help me keep growing closer to Jesus because I found that I was slowly walking away. Now, let me just say, in that, I did not just walk out on my friends and never see them again. I didn't build into my friends who were Christians and walk away from my friends who weren't. But I did allocate my time wisely. You know, if we look at the life of Jesus, this is something that we see in his life over and over again. So he spent time with sinners, but he was surrounded by disciples. You know, for us, we need to spend time with sinners, so to speak. Jesus made that clear. He said in Matthew chapter 5, you are the light of the world. He said, let your light shine before others so that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven. So we need to be spending time with people who do not know Jesus for themselves, but we need to be built up by the people who do. The only way that we're going to be effective, as effective as we can for the kingdom of God in our world, is just like Jesus, being strengthened and built up by disciples. Now, ultimately, if we do try to reach our world for Jesus, but we end up losing Jesus for ourselves, we have made a mistake of eternal proportions. So, hey, Jesus spent time with sinners, but he surrounded himself with disciples. And you know what I love about Jesus? Is that he did spend time with sinners. Not everyone loved this about Jesus, but it shows us his heart towards us. Because ultimately, when it comes to Jesus spending time with sinners, that's Jesus spending time with us. In the New Testament, we read about Jesus hanging out with a bunch of sinners, and all of the religious elite were really upset about it. But this is what Jesus said to them. He said, healthy people don't need a doctor. Sick people do. I have come to call not those who think they're righteous, but those who know they're sinners and need to repent. Jesus spent time with sinners, not to judge them, not to make them feel bad, but to show them there's a better way. To show them that regardless of what their lives had looked like so far, no one was too far gone for God. I'm not sure where everyone's at with Jesus in here today, but you need to know not a single person in this place is too far gone for God. It doesn't matter what your life has looked like so far. It doesn't matter what your life looks like right now. No one is too far gone for God. This is why Jesus came into our world to begin with. If you're here today and you do not know Jesus for yourself, I would love to be able to pray for you. If I could just get people if I could ask you to close your eyes for a moment and bow your heads, just to give people in here some privacy. I want to ask you where you're at with Jesus today. I want to ask you if you know him for yourself, if you have a real relationship with him. And listen, I'm not asking you if you go to church. I'm not asking you if you're a religious person, if you were raised in a Christian household or anything like that. I'm asking you, do you know Jesus? Are you growing closer to him? And if you cannot say yes to that, you need to know that today you can. You can begin a real relationship with Jesus this morning. And so in a moment, I'm going to pray. It's a short, simple prayer inviting Jesus into our lives, starting a real relationship with him. If you're here today and you want me to include you in that prayer, maybe this morning for the very first time in your life, you're saying yes to Jesus. Maybe for you at one point in time, you did have a relationship with Jesus, but you know that right now, for whatever reason, you don't. And this morning, you're picking that relationship back up again. Hey, if that's you, before I pray, I'm going to count to 3. And when I do that, I want you to slip your hand up in the air for me. Just high enough, long enough so I can see it. You can put it straight back down. I just want to know who to include in this prayer. So if that is you, before I pray on the count of 3, just let me know where you're at. 1, 2, 3. If that's you this morning, yeah, awesome. Yeah, unreal. Yeah, I love seeing those hands. You can put them down. That's fantastic. If there's anyone else, and you want to either start a relationship with Jesus for the very first time or you want to reconnect with him today, hey, join these people. Slip your hand up in the air. Let me know where you're at. All right. Awesome. Well, hey, like I said, I want to pray for you. And so what I'm going to do, I'm going to say a prayer. Short, simple prayer. But hey, as a whole church family, I'd love it if we could pray this prayer together with those people who made that decision to follow Jesus today. So church, if you're comfortable, I want to ask you to repeat this prayer after me. Say, God, I thank you for sending Jesus for me. I never deserved it. I could have never earned it. But even still, he willingly came for someone like me. Today, as I step into a real relationship with Jesus, I thank you that I'm forgiven, I'm restored, and from this moment on, we're doing life together in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. Come on, church, let's give it up for those people that made the best decision you can ever make. Man, I love that. I absolutely love that. Come on, congratulations, guys. All right, hey, church, before I finish up, Muta asked me to ask 3 questions. Kind of like he asked last week to get us thinking throughout the week. Church, I want to ask you, what areas of your life have you bowed to compromise instead of standing in conviction? Now listen, truth be told, we all have these areas, but we need to identify them and we need to turn them around. First of all, what areas of your life have you bowed to compromise instead of standing in conviction? Second, what are you justifying that you should be denying? And this could be a relationship, an activity, a place that you go. Technically, it might be justifiable, but it's giving a foothold and opportunity to the devil. And third, what do you need to share with someone? And who is that person that you will be sharing it with? Listen, the what and the who, they need to be specific. Otherwise, you will talk yourself out of it. And I know this is hard to do, being vulnerable, being real with others. But this is what church is for. Everyone here believes in you. Everyone here wants to see you win. And everyone wants to fight alongside of you to see that happen. But when we choose conviction over compromise, we position ourselves to be used by God in ways that we never even dreamed that we could. Relevant, thank you. I love being with you. I'm looking forward to hanging out with you in the foyer afterwards.